So let's get into it. You want to go through the numbers?
Here are your first batch of playoff rankings. I'll go through the top 10. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Number 10, LSU. Woo! Getting hot in here. Number 9, USC. Number 8, your Oregon Ducks. Number 7, TCU. Okay, TCU. Number 6, Alabama. Number 5, Michigan. Number 4, Clemson. Number 3, Georgia. Number 2, Ohio State. And number 1, Tennessee Volunteers, Dan. It has been a charmed season already for the Vols. They ascend to number 1 in the first batch of college football playoff rankings.
Yes.
Okay, we both watched this. What was the ranking that gave you the most pause, the one that you felt the most emotional reaction to? I know you're not much for these playoff rankings, okay? We'll just rip the Band-Aid right off. Everybody knows that about you. But of what you saw, which of these prompted the biggest reaction?
Either Clemson in the top 4 or TCU behind Alabama were the two. And I know you mentioned the LSU at number 10, ahead of a couple of one-loss teams, a few one-loss teams from Power 5 conferences with their own 2 losses. But yeah, I think Clemson at 4 and TCU at 7. I was like, in my head thinking, I'm curious to see how this is defended. Not that I feel all that passionately about Michigan in the top 4 instead of Clemson with certainty. Not that I feel that Clemson is ranked correctly or TCU is ranked specifically correctly. All of these things are going to come together. I'm not worried about those things. But putting an undefeated TCU team behind Alabama, and it's a show about premises, right? And it's the premise that TCU's average defense is what's holding them back, which is, I think, was what Boo Corrigan, Boo, of course, short for Boom Shakalaka. I don't know. Boom Shakalaka Corrigan, or Booyakasha. The premise is, sure, you're undefeated, and that to me is kind of problematic. And I understand that sometimes you can't always judge solely on head-to-head, or sometimes, you have to look at who a team plays in its totality. But there's nothing consistent to me. Georgia has the best win. We can get to that, of all of these teams. Tennessee has the best story and improvement and shock and awe factor on offense. And Ohio State might be the most complete team. And Michigan's defense is probably better than most teams doing most things. But that TCU is undefeated with a pretty good schedule, not a great non-conference schedule. And Alabama doesn't have I think, is Alabama's lone win in the top 25 Texas? Is that my understanding?
I believe so.
So Alabama's lone win in the top 25 is a 1-point win over a pretty flawed Texas team that is not really seen as a top 20-ish team anywhere. And so that's their correct look. That's their impressive look. So I think you got to reward a team like TCU. There's something very strange. Even it was a completely different committee way back when they dropped after beating Kansas the way they did. I think it was 2014, 52-3. I don't get it. I don't get it. Winning is better than losing. It's always better than losing. And TCU has done nothing but win. Now, they've been behind in a couple of games. The defense hasn't been sterling, but I'd much rather win all of my games. How many points did Alabama give up to Tennessee in that loss? It was not a complete impressive performance from Alabama that they happened to lose. Their defense got shredded by a playoff team.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. For those playing along at home, the final score in that Alabama game, 52-49 in favor of now the number 1 Tennessee Volunteers. A couple interesting sound bites that, of course, this is what happens when you are the committee chairperson. You get asked questions point blank from Reese Davis each week after revealing the rankings. Tennessee's 2 wins over Bama and LSU reportedly sealed it for them as number 1. I don't think anyone's going to argue with Tennessee at number 1. We had Ohio State.
I would, but continue.
We had Ohio State at 2 due to the quote, explosive nature of their offense. Okay.
Right.
They were asked specifically about that Alabama versus TCU issue, that conundrum, the one that seemed to drive Joey Galloway nuts on set. And the implication was that Alabama's had a better body of work thus far. And with respect specifically to TCU, the committee was looking for a, quote, balanced team, whatever that means. And
I can tell you what it means.
Continue. Well, I know what it means. What I think the implication was on the TCU front was that they've had a bunch of come from behind wins, and even though they were wins, and even though they remain undefeated, to an extent that was held against them. So that's where they're at. The other thing that I think is interesting, and I hope we can get into, is LSU at 10. Obviously, there are some teams in front of LSU that I think we need to discuss in a little bit more detail, but LSU at 10 definitely sets up at least a slightly more interesting matchup this weekend with Alabama when they play on Saturday evening.
Definitely. And it in a couple of different ways. So LSU losing in embarrassing fashion in week 1. And I think there's something interesting to be said about week 1 with Georgia being ranked 3rd and LSU being ranked 10th. Georgia being ranked 3rd despite having the most impressive win of the season with their win over Oregon. And LSU writing off the extremely ugly and undisciplined and amateurish way in which they lost to Florida State in week 1. Week 1 is being seen right now as, well, it's week 1. Come on, it's week 1. And so that's the viewpoint early on. And so that to me is fascinating because Georgia, I would have Georgia atop, still atop the rankings because of that week 1 performance. Because you're looking at Tennessee's best win over Alabama, a game in which they gave up, once again, 49 points. I wouldn't say that was a complete victory, right? Now, Tennessee's defense isn't as bad as TCU's defense on the season. It's certainly not as bad as top 10 Oregon and top 10 USC, which are right now sitting at 94th and 95th, respectively, in points per drive. Quite flawed, those two defenses, to be sure. But I would still have Georgia and their overall performance. So they're being held. It's the performance against Mizzou is being held against Georgia, the 4-point win. Yes,
I don't know if
presumably?
it's so much being. Yeah, I don't know if it's so much anything being held against Georgia as it is Tennessee getting a lot of credit for how they've looked so far. On the Georgia front, we're going to talk about it when we do our Week 10 Picks podcast, which drops to the general public on Thursday. Right. We can look at what Georgia has done from a resume standpoint. Outside of the Oregon win back in week 1, it's been a minute. Since we looked at this Georgia slate and said, wow, that was an impressive win. I mean, Florida's probably the closest you get to that. And granted, Georgia looked pretty good, but in terms of resume top to bottom, I don't know. There are cases to be made probably on both sides of that Tennessee-Georgia argument.
Well, yeah, it's the question of, is Tennessee's kind of disappointing but beat up defense and presumably getting healthier? Again, there's a lot of premises and presumptions that need to be spoken of when you talk about week 1 of the college football playoff rankings. But Tennessee right now sitting at, and this is a metric important to me, it's versus FBS teams and it excludes garbage time. Tennessee sitting at the 28th best national defense. And they went back and forth with Pitt. I believe that was an overtime game. And that's scheduling Pitt in a home and home, I think, is a positive thing. But Georgia right now has the 3rd most efficient scoring defense and the 4th most efficient scoring offense. And like you mentioned, it's not against the best overall level of competition thus far when you look at their schedule. But I would still have them. Their performance against who they've played has been more impressive than what Tennessee has done because Alabama merely beating Texas by 1 has not aged especially impressively, right? Beating Mississippi State the way that Alabama has, we thought would be more impressive than it turns out to have been with what Mississippi State has done this year, with what Arkansas's defense, and Arkansas was in that game in the second half. I think it was 28-23 against Alabama with a backup quarterback. I think Alabama's a really good team, a potentially playoff caliber team if they can get a little bit better on the road, especially on defense, but that's a big if. There's a premise there. I right now in my mind, and you can tell me what your top 4 is. I would have Georgia, Tennessee, Ohio State, Tennessee, and then I might have TCU there. Maybe Michigan, though.
Yeah, the Michigan one to me is fascinating. The Michigan one to me is fascinating. Look, you could look at what Michigan's done so far this season. The win against Penn State, I thought was damn impressive, right? Bar none, that was a damn impressive win. Iowa has since faded, so the win on the road at Iowa, albeit still on the road against a good defense, probably doesn't have as much shine as it did back in week 5 when it occurred. The Michigan State win.
Can I jump in real quick? What was Iowa's score week 1 against South Dakota State? We weren't looking at the win. I mean, they lost to Iowa State in week 2, scoring a touchdown. 10-7 was the way they lost. So by the time they played that game against Michigan, they were already seen as a catastrophic half team. So it's a good win for Michigan. The score is not fully representative of the control Michigan had in that game late, but I'd like to be on the record pushing back a little bit that Iowa and that win has faded since 7-3 over South Dakota State. America has faded Iowa.
Well, look, I'm not arguing against that. All I'm saying is just that I think we know more with the benefit of 4 extra weeks of college football that win may not be as valuable as we thought in the moment. So Iowa is the road win. The big home win was against Penn State. The win this past weekend was against Michigan State, obviously, in rather dominant fashion. I think thus far with what we've seen from Michigan, they look utterly dominant. And I have seen nothing from this team that has led me to think that they don't belong in that top 4. So I was a bit surprised to see Clemson above them.
Okay.
Now, I guess with respect to the top 25 as it's laid out, maybe Clemson has wins over more teams that are in this top 25, notably Wake and Syracuse. But Clemson also has had this issue. If they want to make that argument on the TCU side, that TCU's had to come back, maybe they haven't looked as impressive the full way through each of their games as a team like in Alabama. Clemson's been really bad in the first halves of not all their games, but a good chunk of their games so far this season. We're going to see them on the road this weekend against Notre Dame. We'll see what that looks like. I have some suspicions. I think I feel pretty confident, let's say, about which direction that one's going to head. But alas, it's a hard argument to make for me that Clemson belongs there over Michigan. That said, this is only the first rankings. This is only the first batch of rankings. It really doesn't mean anything. Of all the batches of rankings that we're going to see over the next coming weeks, this is the one that means the least. It definitely sets the tone to some extent, but there's clearly room for Michigan to jump above Clemson. There's clearly room for somebody to knock off Clemson here in the waning weeks of the college football season. I think that one to me was probably the biggest surprise. Michigan all the way down at 5. The other one that surprised me was LSU at 10. I didn't think they'd do it. We both are pretty high on LSU, but alas, LSU is 15th in the latest revision of the AP Top 25. LSU being at 10 sets up a very interesting matchup. Now, it was already interesting before, but it's got higher stakes now, given the fact that Alabama's presently on the outside looking in of this playoff rankings. So curious to get your thoughts on the LSU thing, because you've been pretty high on them all year.
I like LSU, but at the same time, they go down big to Ole Miss and they mount a furious comeback and beat them by, 3 touchdowns, 24, 25 points. I'm just a little bit confused on what exactly our fully formed opinion is on the Tigers. If we suddenly love Ole Miss, that's the question to me, is what Ole Miss is going to be a big time decider in all of this. Ole Miss and their performance against LSU, or lack thereof, especially in the second half. Ole Miss against Alabama later on. I don't know. Ole Miss is one of those teams that has underperformed a little bit at times. Super impressive last week against 3-5, now 3-5 Texas A&M, and what they were able to do on the ground. I'm curious about the resume right now of LSU, because they had a very clear shot, LSU did, at home at least a clear playoff contender right now, and they lost by 27 points to Tennessee. And so that the playoff committee is higher on LSU than most of us is intriguing. And I think a lot of this is shaping up that the committee is hoping Alabama makes that move, that they're setting up Alabama's schedule in such a way that they're going to have all of these opportunities against playoff top 25 teams or playoff top 10 or playoff top 15 teams to justify the Alabama bump into the top 4. The committee has always been infatuated with Alabama. Many different iterations of the committee have been infatuated with Alabama. And for good reason, they've performed well, but I still think you need to look at each season in a vacuum. That to me is fascinating because right now, a loss to a very much average Florida State, with losing the way that they have lately, jumping out to leads and fading, and then a 4-point win against Auburn that made me paint my face because LSU couldn't cover that game. A Florida team that I don't think anybody holds in super high regard, and if we do hold Florida in high regard, then you should probably be rewarding Georgia a little bit more. And Tennessee didn't really separate themselves from Florida. That was a 5-point game. So it's just everything is all over the place. I'd like to, can we nitpick for a little while about a couple of teams a little bit higher ranked than LSU?
Please.
Does Clemson, current playoff Clemson, do they have a starting quarterback that we're positive on their identity?
Well, Dabo says that DJU is the guy, but we're going to find out, I think, a little bit more about Clemson this coming weekend. Now, look, I'm a Notre Dame fan. You know where I stand on the Irish. And I do not have that much confidence that they're going to mount any kind of serious charge here against Clemson on Saturday evening. The issue, though, on the Clemson side, or I guess on the side of anybody trying to get in front of Clemson, is the remaining teams on Clemson's schedule. At least in the regular season, Notre Dame's the best one. Unless you're going South Carolina over Notre Dame or Louisville, certainly Miami is not better than Notre Dame or any of those other teams that I mentioned at this juncture in the season. So it's getting late early here for the Tigers to drop one. And that's not to say that they can't, that they don't have it in them, but it may not be so much a function of do they have a quarterback, do they not have a quarterback, as it is the competition around them is just not very strong.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a couple different things to nitpick about Clemson at the moment. If we're talking about a complete team, gave up a ton of points to Wake Forest, current top 25 playoff team, Wake Forest, but not a Wake Forest team that's especially trending in the right direction at the time this playoff ranking was released. Yes?
Correct.
Okay. And then Clemson is in a battle with a top 25 team in Syracuse. And what do in the middle of that game? They turn to their backup quarterback because their current starting quarterback was not good enough, was not getting it done. That, to me, is the issue with Clemson, that they have not shown themselves. They didn't separate themselves until late against Georgia Tech, a woeful Georgia Tech. But again, week one, I don't know, man. I need to see a lot more from Clemson, and their resume doesn't impress me. It's a Shania situation for me that they don't impress me much. So I'm not there with Clemson and Michigan. If I'm nitpicking Michigan, we talked about this on the show this past week. It's a question of what does their offense look like in terms of when they perform against even Illinois, but usually just Ohio State, really, or if they end up in the Big Ten championship game. In the red zone, they don't trust J.J. McCarthy. They're not turning, scoring opportunities into touchdowns nearly as often as they should be. And that's the nitpick against Michigan at the moment. Alabama's a defense issue to me right now. They just don't seem to be there against some of the better offenses that they've played. It underscores the fact that I think there are three really, really good and deserving teams in Georgia, Ohio State, and Tennessee. And then there's a confusing fall off to me.